As I was looking over the remarks I'm going to make this afternoon last night, it occurred to me that I had been what the Brits call too clever by half. And I just thought you probably wouldn't be able to follow the argument I was trying to lay out. So I'm going to use an old pedagogical device. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say. And then I'm going to say it. And when I get done, I'm going to tell you what I've said. So that if you don't follow me, it will then be your fault and not mine. I have, I think, three themes in my remarks this afternoon. Since the theme of this annual convention, this summer session, has been freedom, I'm going to talk about freedom. The title of my talk actually has changed several times. I think in the program it is A Voice Raised for Freedom with some subtitle. Well, at least I want to change the subtitle. And the subtitle will now be similar to the one that's there, but it will be Nirvana, Self-Knowledge, and Karma. Nirvana, Self-Knowledge, and Karma. And I will be talking about freedom, and the first theme, the first point I want to make is that freedom and restrictions are not incompatible. And in fact, they are complementary, and indeed even mutually necessary. And the second theme running through my remarks will be that freedom and activity are not incompatible, but in fact are complementary and necessary. And the third theme will deal with practical applications of some of the things we've been talking about. That is to say, what can we do, especially in the Theosophical Society, to realize some of these ideas we've been dealing with over the past few days. Now, that means my remarks this afternoon are going to fall into, or rather the program this afternoon is going to fall into two parts. One is sort of theoretical, right? And the other is going to be practical. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you all know that theory is a lot easier than practice, right? So consequently, I'm going to do the theory. I'm going to let you do the practice. But I'll tell you how that works in a little bit. However, I will give you an advance warning of how it works. After I've made my theoretical remarks, we're going to do something collectively together which will be practical. And I want you to be thinking about something in preparation for that. This will give you something to do when you grow bored with the sound of my voice droning on. When you get really bored and sleepy, you can start thinking about this. And what I want you to think about is, what is it that the Theosophical Society might do that it is not now doing in order to further the work of theosophy? And this can be any number of kinds of things. You may think about some grand, vast, ambitious new program. That's fine. Or you may think about some little detail right here at headquarters that you have experienced during the few days you've been here that might be different. All right? But just keep in mind and start thinking about what we might do that, so far as you know, we're not now doing. Clear? All right, very good. Now to the theory. H.P. Blavatsky ended the preface to her first great theosophical book, Isis Unveiled, with these words, quote, "Our voice is raised for spiritual freedom, and our plea is made for enfranchisement from all tyranny, whether of science or theology," end quote. Although there was in her day, and still is, political tyranny all over the globe, she was not talking about it. She was talking instead about freedom from something she called spiritual tyranny. Tyranny of the mind and of the soul. And that tyranny, I would suggest to you, is far more widespread than political tyranny. Because every society which has political tyranny also necessarily has spiritual tyranny. Isn't that true? An effort to control the minds and souls of its citizens. But even in democratic societies, there is a kind of spiritual tyranny. Indeed, I would suggest that in all human societies there is an impulse to spiritual tyranny. It's the impulse to insist that everybody should believe and think and feel and act like me. It comes from the conviction that there is and can be only one truth in the world, and I've got it. Spiritual tyranny is the fruit of fundamentalism. Whether that fundamentalism is Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or any other variety. And let me suggest that even theosophists are not immune from the impulse toward fundamentalism and its concomitant spiritual tyranny. You know, we can quote an author, whether it be St. Paul or Mohammed or Blavatsky, for a number of reasons. We can quote an author because what that author has written is wonderfully clear, or moving, or insightful, or inspiring, or because what the author has written is a challenging idea, which we may not agree with, but which moves us to examine the thoughts expressed. Or, on the other hand, we can quote a writer as an authority to prove our point, because we take that writer as authoritative and conclusive. It is so because X said so. When we do the latter thing, we are being fundamentalistic. There are a number of characteristics of fundamentalism, and Martin Marty at the University of Chicago here, who is one of the world's leading authorities on fundamentalisms, has talked in this hall about the characteristics of fundamentalism. But I think that the basic one is a subservience of individual judgment to an authority, a giving up of the individual will. When we reject all views other than the one we have canonized and regard all those other views as departures from the true faith, as heresies or neo-versions of some true teaching, when we do that, we are being spiritually tyrannical. And when we are fundamentalistic or spiritually tyrannical, we are betraying the injunction of Jesus, who said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." We are also betraying or ignoring the dying words of the Buddha, which were, "Work out your own salvation with diligence." Authority does not make us free. Knowing the truth for ourselves does. Authority will not save us. We must work diligently for our own salvation. Now, political freedom is precious, but spiritual freedom is priceless. Blavatsky devoted her life to pointing the way to spiritual freedom. She said that every human being is born with a longing to be free. So in The Secret Doctrine, the second volume, she wrote of, quote, "that law in nature which implants in man, as well as in every beast, a passionate, inherent, and instinctive desire for freedom and self-guidance." I think that's a very profound and true statement, but I also think it's only half the truth. Although we have an instinctive desire for freedom and self-guidance, we also have a need for support, direction, and security. We have a need for restrictions. Children need room to grow, but they also need the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Children who are never allowed to make their own decisions will grow up either repressed or rebellious. But children who are never given any guidance or rules will grow up antisocial and undisciplined. Freedom is exhilarating and joyous, but it can also be frightening. So in this, as in so many other ways, we walk a razor's edge between opposing forces. As both children and adults, we need to be free, but we also need the security of wise direction. The freedom we desire is not licentiousness, and the direction we need is not dictatorship. But everything needs its complementary opposite, in moderation. On the checkerboard of life, we must move over both bright and dark squares. You can't play checkers if you've got a monochrome board. You've got to have the contrasting squares to do it. We need both freedom and direction. Those who try to move only on the squares of freedom are rebels without a cause, dropouts from society and humanity, spiritual hippies, flotsam and jetsam on the tides of evolution. Those who try to move only on the squares of prescription are true believers, adherents of a cult, whether that cult is materialistic or religious fundamentalism. Blavatsky's Science and Theology. And you know, we often think of science and religion as being opposites, don't we? That they seem to be quite different from one another. And yet, in some ways, they are curiously alike. Each includes an impulse to fundamentalism. Scientific fundamentalism is the reduction of all life to quantifiable material realities and the refusal to recognize anything that cannot be duplicated in a laboratory. Religious fundamentalism is the surrender of personal irresponsibility to a spiritual dictator and the gullible acceptance of whatever that authority says. But both are desperate cries for certainty in a universe that is greater and more mysterious than any of us can comprehend. Human evolution is not served by rejecting those aspects of life that our intellects cannot grasp, as the scientific fundamentalist would do. Nor is it served by subordinating our judgment to that of another and abdicating our responsibility to choose, as religious fundamentalists would. Human evolution is served by balancing our desire for direction with our need for freedom. And you know, there are two kinds of freedom. There's freedom from, and there is freedom to. Freedom from releases us from the tyranny of our environment. It's a passive kind of freedom. Freedom to empowers us to guide ourselves. It's active. Brother K.H. might have been thinking of those two freedoms, freedom from and freedom to, when he advised A.P. Sinnett to study the two concepts of karma and nirvana, which he called the double key to metaphysics, two of the seven great mysteries. In letter 16, he was answering a question from Sinnett about spiritualism. You know, it's quite remarkable in a way how much of the Mahatma letters deals with spiritualism. It was a very hot topic at the time. He was discussing this subject, but in doing so, he mentioned how karma was involved with spiritualism, the effects of karma in relation to spiritualism, and then he briefly digressed. He said, quote, "In connection with this, let me tell you before that since you seem so interested with the subject, you can do nothing better than to study the two doctrines of karma and nirvana as profoundly as you can. Unless you are thoroughly well acquainted with these two tenets, the double key to the metaphysics of Abhidharma, you will always find yourself at sea in trying to comprehend the rest. We have several sorts of karma and nirvana in their various applications to the universe, the world, devas, buddhas, bodhisattvas, men and animals. The second, nirvana, including its seven kingdoms. Karma and nirvana are but two of the seven great mysteries of Buddhist metaphysics, and but four of the seven are known to the best Orientalists, and that very imperfectly." End quote. Now, I would suggest that's a profound statement with a number of interesting implications. Among them, these three. First, karma and nirvana are centrally important ideas for our understanding of reality and ourselves. Second, the two concepts of karma and nirvana are linked. And third, there are different kinds of karma and of nirvana depending upon their relations to different aspects of reality. Now, karma is basic to the world we live in. It's this world of samsara, which Joy mentioned this morning. Samsara is a Sanskrit word meaning that which flows together. Literal meaning, that which flows together. It is used as a name for our everyday world because ours is a world of becoming, in which things are ever-changing or flowing, and in which everything affects everything else through the law of karma, and hence all things flow together. Samsara is the world of bondage, the opposite of nirvana or liberation. It is the world of birth and death as they are governed by karmic law. And karma itself is curiously twofold. On the one hand, it's the bond that ties us to this world of samsara, But on the other hand, because karma is linked with the concepts of choice and free will, and you can't have karma without free will and choice, it is also our key for freedom to escape from samsara and reach nirvana. The way in is the way out. Karma is a revolving door. The problem is that it revolves so fast that when we start to exit by it, it whooshes around, and before we know it, we're back in again. Nirvana, as you all will know, comes from a root meaning to blow out. It is the extinguishing of all limitations, and so it is our key for freedom from karma and its consequences. Though karma is all around us, and indeed it may be something that we have more of than we want, nirvana may seem to us like a very far-off and abstract place, a distant prospect, not unlike the Christian concept of heaven, with its golden gates and angels parked on clouds strumming their harps. Yet in fact, nirvana too is all around us. Every freedom from limitation is a kind of nirvana. Now, there are two attitudes towards karma and nirvana. One seeks to escape from the world of samsara and of karma, the flowing world, and to enter the world of nirvana, never to return. But I would suggest to you that that is an exoteric attitude, and that the esoteric attitude is to recognize that it is only our unknowing, our ignorance, which makes samsara and nirvana appear to be opposites, whereas in fact they are the two sides of one coin, the two aspects of one reality, the cause and effect of one action. We live our lives between the twin poles of karma and nirvana, which are restrictions and free choices. Karma is restriction. It limits what we've got available. Nirvana is freedom, unrestricted choice. Our true goal is neither to be controlled by karma nor to escape from it, but to use it knowingly and well. Some people seek to escape from our karmically controlled world into a nirvanic freedom, and they are the spiritual hippies. Other people seek to ignore the reality of a transcendent existence free of all limitations and suppose instead that one limited statement of truth is all the truth that can be. And they are the spiritual fundamentalists. Karma and nirvana, law and freedom are close linked. They are indeed the double key, as K.H. said, to spiritual growth, freeing us from what limits us and guiding us to realize our full potential. Now, it's clear, I think, that one of the motives for founding the Theosophical Society back in the last quarter of the last century was to combat the twin fundamentalisms of materialistic science and dogmatic religion. That's perfectly clear if you read Blavatsky's writings. And that challenge is to a large extent still before us, because much science is still materialistic. You know, we get very excited sometimes about progress in theoretical physics and new ideas, and we say, science is discovering the ancient wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not true for most scientists. Most working laboratory scientists still function on an entirely materialistic basis. And certainly much religion is still dogmatic. We don't have to have examples of that, do we? Is that not all around us? But I think it's also clear that there was another motive for founding the society, and that other motive was to combat spiritual irresponsibility. The ideal of the theosophical life is not, to use John Milton's words, that of a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without heat and dust. We are not to seek nirvana by withdrawing from the world of karma, but by realizing the interdependence of law or restrictions and freedom. We are to run the race with all its heat and dust for the sake of the immortal garland. Or as the voice of the silence puts it, shalt thou abstain from action, not so shall gain thy soul its freedom. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child. Let me put a few glosses on that splendid verse. I think perhaps the most important verse in all theosophical writings. Shalt thou abstain from action, that is, from the world of karma, our everyday life, our daily responsibilities. Not so shall gain thy soul her freedom, that is, her nirvana. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge. And what is self-knowledge? But knowledge of the self, right? That is to say, of one's own self and one's relationship to the universal self. And self-knowledge is of loving deeds. Loving deeds, action for the sake of others. The child. That verse, I would suggest, is the keynote of Theosophy. When some of her students complained to Blavatsky about being discouraged at the difficulty of living up to what was expected of them, she wrote to them, and this is a typical Blavatsky response, right, to someone who's discouraged. She wrote to them, "Read the voice, I say, for it was written for and dedicated to you by Master's special orders. Therein you will find all your inquiries anticipated and answered." Well, I think there is no sentence in the whole voice that speaks more directly and clearly to the theosophical ideal than this one. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child. That's the ideal of Theosophy. To liberate ourselves by learning about ourselves through unselfish action in the world. How do we find out who we are, what we're like? Well, but by withdrawing to the mountaintop in solitude. That's not what the voice says. How does the voice say? We learn about ourselves, we discover who we are.
Loving deeds.
Loving deeds, by going out and working for the sake of others. By working for others, we learn about ourselves, and by learning about ourselves, we reach freedom. That's the ideal of Theosophy, to liberate ourselves by learning about ourselves through unselfish actions in the world. That liberation requires the head, the heart, and the hands. By our head, we come to knowledge, by our heart to love, and by our hands to deeds. This threefold ideal of head, heart, and hands is expressed also by the three objects of the Theosophical Society in an interlinked chain. And now I think we have a handout, and could we pass out the handout at this point? It is a little diagram and a table, and it will help you to follow what I'm about to say. I know that all of you are familiar with the three objects of the Theosophical Society. Well known though they are, let us consider again their wording as we now have the objects. And while the handout is being passed out, let me just remind you of how the objects run. 1, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. 2, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. And 3, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. One of the problems with a statement as familiar to all of us as the objects are is that we stop thinking about what they mean. Right? Any statement which is extremely familiar loses meaning. Is that not true? For most Christians, has not the Lord's Prayer lost meaning, in fact? It's something which is ritually repeated, and it ceases to be living any longer. So I think there's a danger that the objects begin to appear to us as routine statements of something, whereas I think the objects are extraordinarily interesting and are full of wisdom and of direction. If you would now follow the diagram at the top of the handout, notice that the operative verbs of the three objects, the first verb in each object, those verbs are to form, to encourage, and to investigate. Those three verbs express the actions of the hands, the heart, and the head. To form is a physical action of giving form to. To encourage is an emotional action, for the word etymologically means to give heart to. To encourage, to hearten, to give heart to. And to investigate is an intellectual action. It's the sort of thing we associate with that very brainy detective Sherlock Holmes. Since the word investigate etymologically means to get onto the tracks or footprints of. Right? It comes from a Latin word meaning track or footprint, to follow the tracks of, the way Sherlock Holmes did with his magnifying glass. So the opening words of the three objects clearly relate, each one of them, to one of the three aspects of theosophical life: forming with the hands, encouraging with the heart, and investigating with the head. Then if we look at the objects of those verbs, we find again the same three aspects: hands, heart, and head, but each moved on one step. So in the first object, what we form with our hands is a nucleus of universal brotherhood. However, what makes such a nucleus is an action of the heart, feeling the reality of brotherliness and empathizing with our brothers. The existence of true brotherhood depends upon the sentiments of brotherliness that we have. It is the heart that governs brotherhood. Similarly, in the second object, what we encourage with our hearts is the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. But study is in the head. It involves learning and knowing, a mental activity and state. Finally, in the third object, what we investigate with our heads are laws and powers, which are states and actions of the world around us, the physical world. The laws of nature, both explained and unexplained, govern the whole state of the world, and human powers, both dynamic and latent, are the means by which we act in the world. And so the three objects of the society tell us not once, but twice, that theosophy is a matter of the hands, the heart, and the head. And in addition, they tell us that the action of our hands, the feeling of our hearts, and the understanding of our heads are all one, each being interlinked and affecting the other. You may remember that St. Luke's Gospel tells a story about two sisters named Mary and Martha. Mary was a head person, an intellectual who liked to listen to the conversation before and after dinner and to join in the discussion around the table. Her sister Martha was a practical hands person who kept house and fixed the dinner, making it possible for the head people to sit around doing the talking. In Palestine, in the time of Christ, just as today in 20th century America, there was a tendency for practical hands people to regard intellectual head people as useless parasites. So when Martha grumbled about Mary shirking the work, Christ rebuked Martha and praised Mary for having made a better choice. But we must not misinterpret that story. It would be a great mistake to conclude that therefore heads are better than hands. Conversation doesn't cook supper. And a talking head with no hands doesn't get to eat. And we all know how important that is, right? Both sisters are needed. The Marthas of this world make life possible, and the Marys give it purpose. There's a traditional theosophical saying, which is often quoted as part of Founders' Day programs in theosophical groups, which I think may have originated with Annie Besant. Maybe Joy can tell us as soon as I tell you what the saying is. It goes like this: H.P. Blavatsky, who incidentally was a Mary if there ever was one. Can you imagine Blavatsky keeping house? H.P. Blavatsky gave the world theosophy. And H.S. Alcott, who was a real Martha, right? A real Martha. H.S. Alcott gave it the Theosophical Society. Who can say which gave it the greater gift? Is that Besant?
Yes, it is.
Both. In her handwriting, there we go. Both were needed, Blavatsky and Alcott. For without the society, theosophy would have had no way of being carried forward. But without theosophy, the society would have had no reason to exist. They are complementary, not competitive. And you know, in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about right-brained people and left-brained people. You all are aware of that? You know, it's sort of passed by now, but there was a few years ago. The left hemisphere of the brain is supposed to control language and logic, whereas the right hemisphere is supposed to control music and art. Those whose left hemispheres are dominant are supposed to be intellectual, abstract, and analytical. Those with the dominant right hemisphere, on the other hand, are supposed to be aesthetic, sympathetic, and synthesizing. Now, left-brained people may think that right-brainers are all touchy-feely and fuzzy-headed, whereas right-brained people are likely to feel that left-brainers are calculating and cold fish. But neither is better than the other, and neither is adequate alone. If people are only right-brained or only left-brained, it doesn't matter which they are, because in either case they're half-wits. In the Theosophical Society, we have long heard talk about heart people and head people. Haven't you all heard that within the last year? Those are our equivalent of right-brained and left-brained. Of course, there are also hands people in the society. Now, we don't hear as much about them, maybe because they don't talk as much, but perhaps also because we don't have nearly as many of them as we need. Now, it's normal for a person, I think, to be dominantly one of these three types or another. But to be a whole person, we can't be only one type. We've got to have a head, we've got to have a heart, and we've got to have hands. When Dorothy skipped down the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, she had to be accompanied by three companions. The Scarecrow, who was in search of brains, the Tin Woodman in search of a heart, and the Lion in search of the courage to act and to do. You have to have all three characteristics. There are many correspondences here, and now I would refer you to the table at the bottom of the handout. Hands correspond to the physical world, to our persona or public personality, and to the waking state. Heart corresponds to the emotional world, our unconscious personality, and the dreaming state. Head corresponds to the mental world, our conscious ego, and the dreamless state. But beyond all these sets of threes, there is always a fourth, the integrated whole, the Buddhic world of wisdom and sympathy, the immortal monad, and the fourth state, which has no limitations and is therefore nirvana, freedom. As theosophists, we must use our hands, our hearts, and our heads, not separately, but harmoniously, that we may be whole. Our goal is nirvana, freedom. But nirvana is not a state of spiritual catatonia in which we spend eternity doing nothing. Don't you think that's the way we often think of nirvana? I don't think that's it. Nirvana is the result of doing the good with our hands, feeling the beautiful with our hearts, and knowing the true with our heads, thereby discovering the one in all of us. The voice of the silence tells us how to get to that state. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child. Deeds of love produce self-knowledge, which leads to nirvana or freedom. The spiritual freedom of nirvana comes from that understanding of ourselves and the world around us, which we call self-knowledge. Such understanding is the result of acting in the world with unselfish care for the welfare of others, deeds motivated by love. In the Bhagavad Gita, such deeds are called nishkama karma, action without the regard for the fruit of action, without personal desire. Nirvana and karma are indeed the double key to the understanding of life, because the spiritual freedom of nirvana is the goal we seek, and the karma of unselfish action or loving deeds is the way to achieve it. Action leads to freedom, but paradoxically, freedom leads to action. Nirvana, self-knowledge, and karma. These are the core of theosophy, and it is to them that the true theosophist is dedicated: head, heart, and hands. Now, we've finished the theoretical part. You can all breathe a deep sigh of relief now. We've finished the theoretical part of this program. And before we return to the practical half, let me sum up the points I've tried to make. Right? All right. First of all, let me point out that there are two kinds of opposites. Right? Actually, there are many kinds of opposites, but there are two kinds which I'm focusing on particularly. One is a contradiction, and the other is a complementation. If we both bite into the same bit of fruit, and I say, oh, that's bitter, and you say to me, oh, that's not bitter, you have contradicted me, right? Those are contradictions. But if I bite into it and say, oh, that's bitter, and you bite into it and say, oh, that's sweet, you have not contradicted me. Those are complementations. Can something be bitter and sweet at the same time? Is there bittersweet reality? Bittersweet flavors? Bittersweet experiences? Yes, indeed. So something can be both of those apparent opposites at the same time. Those are complementary opposites, not contradictory opposites. All right, then, one point I tried to make is that spiritual freedom has a contradictory opposite, and that is fundamentalism. Right? That to insist on uniformity of belief and action is a contradiction to the notion of spiritual freedom. But freedom has another kind of opposite which is not contradictory but complementary, namely the restrictions of law, regulation, which makes freedom possible. A third point I tried to make is that every freedom is a kind of nirvana. I don't think nirvana is just one thing off in the distant future or a distant place. It's here and now. It's liberation, freedom from certain kinds of restrictions. Every freedom is a kind of nirvana. And every restriction is a kind of karma. Karma is restriction. Freedom is nirvana. The fourth point I tried to make is that nirvana and karma, or freedom and restriction, are the double key to understand ourselves and the world around us. They are interdependent, mutually supportive, and they imply one another. The fifth thing I've tried to suggest is that we become free. This is the voice, I'm again paraphrasing. We become free by discovering who we are, and we discover who we are by responding with love to the world around us. And the sixth point, our response must be with our whole being, not with just part of ourselves. It's got to be with head, heart, and hands, all of us. And since we're theosophists, there has to be a seventh point, right? I can't stop with six. So the seventh point is, therefore, as theosophists, we must make theosophy also a matter of the head, the heart, and the hands. All three of those. Now, this gets us very close to the practical part of this afternoon's program. There's a saying from Proverbs, which has been quoted already this session, and indeed some of you may have heard it at a recent political convention. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Yes. What is the vision of the Theosophical Society? Well, you and I can articulate it. I tried in an article in the AT a couple of issues ago called The Vision to articulate it. But in fact, the vision of the Theosophical Society, Stephen Heller suggested that visions have to come from, no, it wasn't Stephen Heller, excuse me, Ben Ward suggested that visions have to come from leaders. Right? I'm not sure that's totally true. I think that visions, in my article in the AT, I asked everybody to think about a vision. I think it has to be a community thing. But I think both are true. This is often the case where both views are true. In the case of the Theosophical Society, we have got a vision which was given to us by a leader. And that leader was no ordinary human being. It's the Mahachohan. The Mahachohan's letter, the famous Mahachohan's letter, in fact, is often called the charter of the Theosophical Society, but it's also a vision. And what the Mahachohan says in that letter is that theosophy is the foundation of the future religion of humanity. And he says that the Theosophical Society is a core family to realize that future religion. And an essential ingredient of that future religion is spiritual freedom. All right, now, how can we realize that vision? What can we do? And doing is karma, right? What can we do to realize the spiritual freedom, and that's nirvana, which theosophy at its best represents? Now, we are now down to the practical part of today. I want you to imagine that we have available resources to do something we have not done, whether those resources are financial or people or whatever it might be. Don't limit your imagination, right? Unlimited imagination. Think about something that we might do in the Theosophical Society to improve the way we convey theosophy to ourselves and to the world. And I'd like us to break into, this is not going to be, we've talked enough. I'm not going to have a discussion. I hope you all don't mind. No discussion sessions at this, but I'm going to break us into, I think, about 6 groups. I would like to have a recorder for each group, and I will ask the recorder to go around and let each member of his or her group make a suggestion about something that they would like to see the TS do. The recorder is to write down all of these suggestions. When you've gone around, let each person have only one suggestion. First time around, right? This is to make sure we get around to everybody within the group. Then once you've been around everybody in the group once, if people have other suggestions they want to make, go back and pick them up. Right? But be sure you get around to everybody once. Once we have, you have given your ideas to the recorder, then I would ask you please to decide collectively on what 3 ideas out of all of the ones you have produced you would like to present to the group as a whole, because we won't have time to do this for everybody to give an idea. So within each group, decide on 3 that you want to present. Then we'll take about 15 minutes. I think that ought to be enough to do that. Yeah, and we'll let you go get a drink of water before we start it. Then we'll come back and come back together as a whole, and we'll hear from the recorders what those ideas are.
For several moments, convention delegates discussed in their groups the types of activities they felt were most needed in the section. Afterwards, John Algeo asked each group leader to report their group's top 3 suggestions. He then asked the group as a whole to decide by vote which 3 of the several suggestions reported were most important. The results were 27 votes for greater public relations efforts in the form of advertising and TV programs. This included a desire for greater worldwide exposure. 22 votes were cast for more programs involving young people. And finally, 15 people voted for a greater number of TS festivals and regional conferences. In analyzing the results, John Algeo pointed to the positive value of the group's collective judgment by observing that all 3 suggestions focused on different but very necessary goals. He felt the first suggestion was a call for us to make ourselves better known to the outside world. The second indicated the need for planning for the Society's future and coming generation, and that the third suggestion called for a collective strengthening within the group among ourselves.